Board of Supervisors will convene again, and we're at the proponents' arguments. Ms. Burch, I think we are going to continue and introduce your next speaker.
Yes, thank you so much. And I will go ahead and actually I'll let you spell your name for the record.
Daniel Axelrod, that's Axelrod. And I'm a physics professor from the University of Michigan. I still do active research, some of which involves hydrodynamics. It's not really appropriate here to go into the technical details, and I sure don't want to waste your time. I and others have written very extensive technical comments over the last 4 years on this issue. I can only bring out, say, some of the highlights here just to give you a flavor of what's going on. In all of the claims by Crystal Geyser and by AES, it says that the area has been thoroughly analyzed for its hydrogeology, and there's no problem. It has not ever been thoroughly analyzed. The studies that are quoted generally quote previous studies. Those previous studies quote previous studies, most of which rely on something from the late 90s called the Siskiyou report. The Siskiyou report was not intended to look at whether pumping at Crystal Geyser's production well would affect negatively residential wells in the area. That wasn't the intent at all. The intent was to find out if Crystal Geyser's production well was connected to big springs, you know, the water that flows out in Mount Shasta City Park. And the reason they did that isn't because they were particularly concerned about big springs either. They were just concerned that they could put a label on their water that says that it was spring water. So that important Siskiyou study had nothing to do with checking the effect on residential wells. And most of the other studies rely on that. It's very weak legs to stand on. As a matter of fact, the Siskiyou study showed there was a connection between Deck 6 and Big Springs in a very indirect way. It showed that when you draw on Deck 6, it pulled down Decks 1, and Decks 1 had a fluorescent tracer connection with Big Springs. If you look at the data, it's very dubious. I did a calculation on that and found that the connection between Decks 1 and Big Springs is 5%. In other words, 95% of the water that goes under Decks 1 goes somewhere else. So then Crystal Geyser and then AES made a big deal about how when you pull on a production well on the Crystal Geyser site, it has very little effect on Big Springs. Well, of course it doesn't. It's not connected to it very much. So all of that previous study does not hit the key question. Does industrial scale pumping at Deck 6 affect residential wells? And it's not just residential wells, but there are also proposed city wells in the area that the city has actually commented on to you. Okay, so what AES and previous groups have done is made drawdown tests pumping on various wells on their site and looking at the response on their site. They never look at residential wells, never ever. then in order to connect what they studied on their own site with what's further away, but might be connected or might be relevant to the community, they use a model, a computer model, which, as mentioned, is implemented in a software program called PUMPIT. PUMPIT actually is an extremely old and obsolete program that only operates on DOS computers before Windows came into being. Not available anymore. And it's really a trivial equation that it's based on that has nothing to do with the ground structure underneath a volcano. Underneath a volcano, you can have lots of complicated fractures and networks of tubes and water that's going in directions that you did not expect just from the slope of the land on the surface. But the model that PUMPIT is based on is called the Theis equation, assumes that there's lateral homogeneity. In other words, it's the same everywhere, which is absurd. Can't be used for this kind of situation. And every hydrologist I spoke to, and there's more than half a dozen on this, say that this is way too complicated to use such a simple equation. So if their model that's trying to extrapolate their irrelevant results on their own site is not a good model, what do they have? Well, they say, well, that's the best model there is. That is not the case. You can even think of models that would show that distant wells are more affected than nearby wells. Like, for example, the amount of water that's available ultimately comes from snowmelt on Mount Shasta. And let's just say, to oversimplify it, that's a constant rate of water going into the system. That water, at some point, might have a choice. Does it go into the lower aquifer that, say, goes into the production well area, or does it go into the upper aquifer, which supplies residential wells? If it goes more into the lower, it goes less into the upper. Or to put it another way, if Crystal Geyser pumps heavily on the lower, it would rob the upper of its supply of water. That's another model. It's also simple. It's not the Theis equation. It's not the PUMPIT, but it's certainly reasonable. That needs to be checked. Does that happen? There are other reasonable models too. You can even make electrical analogies for how water flows. You can think of models that would show there's a real problem in the upper aquifer where residential wells are drawing from. There's one piece of evidence, there is experimental evidence, there is a problem. Over the years, especially in the late 2000s, the level of water in Deck 6 dropped quite a bit, about on the order of a foot, 2 feet. The level of water in a well on their property that was perforated into the upper aquifer dropped something like 12 feet. The upper aquifer seems to be very sensitive to something that the lower aquifer is not. That's not consistent with a Theis model. That's consistent with one of the models I just told you about, but we don't know which one is which because we need to test. So it could be likely that the upper aquifer will be very sensitive to pumping from the lower aquifer. And they can't do that extrapolation that they talk about in the EIR. I think I spent enough time on this unless you have more questions. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just to wrap up on this hydrology piece of things, I think, what you're hearing is a little bit of what I think about as kind of the backdrop, which is, you have this situation where you have a fairly complicated groundwater situation. It's not something that can be modeled with a very simple model. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't think that these historic pieces of information are necessarily bad or wrong. They were just, they were gathered for a specific purpose, which is not the purpose that we have here. And what we have here is a question. Will this level of industrial pumping impact neighboring wells? It's a burning question if you happen to live next door to the bottling facility. So, and it's also a question that I don't believe has been answered here. So that also raises the additional question that we had earlier about what is the level of production going to be, and will it remain constant? Is there a way to bind the applicant to the project description that is in the EIR now? I don't think there is. But let's just assume that there's this, the project description is accurate, and that level of pumping is going to go on into the future until there's some change that presumably would be approved by the county in light of their certification of the document. The history is that during the time that Dannon was pumping, and it's been referred to in response to comments as anecdotal, a layperson's observations about the impacts to the environment are substantial evidence, and they can very much be and have been considered by courts and taken very seriously. So to the extent that there are anecdotes about neighbors having their wells respond to industrial levels of pumping, that's a piece of information that at the very least needs to be disclosed to the public and the decision makers. It's a piece of information that should inform this analysis about whether or not adjacent wells are going to be impacted by the extraction. So that's really, this is another area where it's complicated. It's very tempting to say, well, there's disagreement amongst the experts. We have experts who've looked at it and say there's no problem. It's not a significant impact. And then we have another expert who's saying, wow, I really think there could potentially be a significant impact. This is not a disagreement amongst experts, because what we have right now is we have historic information, we have modeling, we have some information about how it might react. What we don't have is an analysis of the actual question that's before the agency. And maybe the answer is to say, well, we're going to rely on the information that we have right now and say it doesn't look like there's going to be a significant impact, but we don't really know. I mean, that's the disclosure obligation, right? The disclosure to the public, frankly, the disclosure to you. We don't really know the answer. And what we have right now, I don't believe is enough for you to rely on. So maybe the way to respond is to say, we don't know. It appears based upon, some analysis and modeling that maybe it's not going to be an issue, but it's a fairly straightforward endeavor to say, well, we'll monitor this, right? This also happens all over the state. I see it all the time. You monitor the adjacent wells, and you create, again, a fairly straightforward set of mitigation measures that can be triggered in the event that there are negative impacts to those wells. And maybe that's not the route we want to take. I don't know, but one way or the other, it needs to be determined. So the analysis, the study has to be done now so that you can support the conclusion that it's less than significant, and that hasn't been done yet. Or that adaptive management strategy of monitoring with mitigation measures to be triggered is another way of satisfying CEQA's requirement. At the moment, that's not in place. So that's all I'm going to say about hydrology, the most complicated issue in this whole endeavor. And I just want to briefly talk about, and I know this has been an issue, this has come up many times. I did include in my comments and in my submissions regarding the appeal, the issue of whether or not the county does have authority over the use on this parcel. And I know there's been, the response to that comment is, well, it's heavy industrial zoning. And that zoning designation was put into place a long time ago. The 90-day statute of limitations is run. Therefore, we are stuck with this situation. In my view, the general plan does not allow heavy industrial zoning in this location. And this has to do with the overlay, and I'm not going to go into all of the details of the various policies, but I will say this, California case law is very clear on this topic. There is no statute of limitations because the designation was void at the time it was adopted. If it's inconsistent with the general plan, it's null and void at that moment. And I think that's something that at this stage, I understand. It's been in place for a long time. There's been a lot of disagreement about it. There have been a lot of decisions made based upon the assumption that that heavy industrial zoning is valid and appropriate for that particular location. But I don't think that it is. And I think that the county finds itself in a situation where there's a use that's occurring on a property where it really isn't compatible with adjacent uses. And I mean, there's a very good reason why heavy industrial isn't allowed in that overlay. So I just want to raise that issue. I want to bring your attention to the fact that I don't think that there's a problem with looking at that and saying, you know, it was a different set of decision makers back at the time that was decided that would be a heavy industrial zoning designation. But I think in light of the inconsistency with the general plan, that's something that the county could revisit. And so unless there are any questions, that concludes my comments.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the board? Supervisor Nixon.
Thank you very much, Ms. Birch. That was thorough and easy to understand. Thank you. You're right. There's a heck of a lot of technical stuff here. You submitted the main appeal document dated October 5th, but I also see a packet from you dated November 9th. It looks like a lot of the same material. What are the main differences, and why the second submission?
Well, the second submission was in response to, there's a procedural sort of outline that comes through a series of resolutions by previous boards. And there was a submission that was required on that date. So it was essentially my appeal document with additional information that had been pulled. And it's, because I know in response to my appeal document, I know that the staff kind of did a similar thing. There was a lot of information coming from responses to comments and that sort of thing. Just kind of fleshed out each of the issues. So they're the same set of issues with just additional information included.
Ah, okay. That was sort of my conclusion.
Yeah, and it was with that that submission on the 9th that we were to include any new information, and that's when the health risk assessment and those things were attached.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. My next question, hopefully this will be my last one, runs to your statement that the conditions of approval of this use permit for the caretaker's residence and the mitigation measures in it may not be enforceable by the county. I wish I had more legal expertise in this area. I do not. But I think there's a huge conflict here between our understandings. And this may be a very simplistic way of putting it, and if so, I'm embarrassed. But it is my understanding that if the county approves the caretaker's residence use permit with all of the conditions of this EIR and the mitigation measures, and Crystal Geyser exercises the rights under that permit and builds this residence, then all of these things are enforceable by the county. If it chooses not to build the caretaker's residence, then they aren't. And they'll have to wait for the next permit. I understand there are 4 or 5 or 6 more that are coming down the pike before they can commence operations. And at each one of those points, then all of these become enforceable. But I think they're enforceable now, aren't they?
Well, in some ways, this question is answered at various locations, and I'm afraid I don't have citations to the page numbers here. There are places throughout the environmental document where it says we have no authority to prevent them from extracting more than what they've identified as in the project description, and that the county does not have authority to control those activities. If the enforcement mechanism for the county for the caretaker's residence permit would be to revoke the permit. There's no mechanism to enforce against an activity that's occurring at the bottling facility. You can't revoke their bottling facility permit because you haven't issued one. So there's the county itself, or at least through the environmental document, has been very reluctant to say that they have any enforcement authority at all over the activities at the bottling facility. So the conditions are attached to a permit for a caretaker's residence. And you raise a good point. If you certify this EIR, this is where you certify the EIR, you're certifying it for the project. And that has been identified to include the bottling facility activities. And so in some ways you have this conditional use permit, and that's an action to approve that. But you're also certifying the environmental document as being sufficient under CEQA for the project, that as that has been described in the document. And that hasn't been described as the caretaker's residence. It's been described as this much larger activity. And then there's this conflicting assertion that you have no authority or control over the activities of the bottling facility. So I understand what you're saying, that when ordinarily when you're issuing a permit, you have all of these conditions of approval. It's fairly straightforward understanding to say, well, if you violate the conditions, we'll revoke your permit. And you can no longer engage in that activity that we've authorized you to engage in through the permit. But by certifying this EIR, there's an approval of this bottling facility. And I hear what you're saying. I don't think there's a clear answer about the enforceability. Again, there are options to ensure that the mitigation measures are enforceable. And there are development agreements and those kinds of things that occur all the time. I think that maybe the answer is to make some changes to the document and make clear that the county will have some enforcement authority, and explain how exactly that would be exercised and how that would look, because it's very contradictory throughout the document that, oh no, we can't regulate how much they extract or any of those things. It's just not something that we have any authority over. And then at the same time, there's this conditional approval of just that one piece.
Well, I think there needs to be a distinction between the enforceability of the project description and the enforceability of the mitigation measures. Those are two very different things. And I think you're right. The county does not have full control over exactly what they do operationally in some areas, but I think it does have control over the mitigation measures. That's my understanding anyway.
Well, and I think that your point about the project description being a separate issue from the mitigation measures, I guess in some ways it is. Unfortunately, the mitigation measures are tied directly to the project description. So if you had a project description that said, this project will involve, unlimited groundwater extraction, your mitigation measures would look very different than they do right now. And so I guess that's something to consider, is the fact that the mitigation measures are coming directly out of the project description.
Thanks.